Well, good morning, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all for hanging in there to the very final parallel session for this global learning event. Before we move on just into the substantive discussion for today, let me give you the usual logistics announcements. Hopefully you're very familiar with them at this stage. This session is interpreted into French, Arabic, Spanish, and English. Please go into the Zoom channel option with the global icon and select your preferred language. We will be using a Mentimeter, which I'll explain shortly, but also we would like you to have active discussion in the Q&A box, because we will be using the Q&A box throughout this phone call. And as a starting challenge, maybe to speak to that, what I would really like to do at this point, for those of you who are joining this conversation, why don't you go into the chat box, maybe tell us the expectation you have for this session and what you would like to get out of this session. I would argue that this has been one of the trickier sessions to organize for the global learning events. This is not a science. This is where some of the technical aspects and the political economy both intersect, and it's an imperfect science. And that's why this session features in our penultimate set of parallel sessions, Meet the Practitioners. I'm really excited by the practitioners that we have today, really a stellar lineup of panelists, each of whom I will introduce as we go along, just to save a little bit of time. Before that, let me just give you a couple of expectations in terms of how we would like to take the conversation today. As a panel, we've worked a little bit together to try and frame this into the conversation. So take a deep breath. There are no PowerPoints anymore for the rest of the global learning events, possibly one left over for the closing session. But our expectations for this session are a couple of things. We want to tilt the focus around the question of financing. We talked so much about sustainability in the course of the last 3 days. Sustainability brings into question all of the institutional arrangements, but also the question of financing. Financing not just from year to year, but the financing perspective in the long term to ensure that these programs can continue into the future. The session is really motivated by this idea of moving to scale and really understanding the financing decisions that a Ministry of Finance counterpart needs to bring into the table. So how we think about budgeting, how we think about budget lines, how we think about economic inclusion and social protection investments relative to other sectors, and what trade-offs are implied by that. But also, what are some of the push factors which ensure ownership and greater commitment from a budgetary perspective from the government side. Much of the discussions today will feed off the findings in the State of Economic Inclusion report, which highlighted some positive directions in financing. Over half of economic inclusion programs led by governments were funded either in whole, 29%, or in part, 71% by governments. And 36 countries had dedicated budget lines for expenditure in this area. But we'll hear more from our panel. And just before passing over to our panel, let's start off with the usual poll. So at this stage, I think you should all be very familiar with Mentimeter. If you're not, log on to menti.com. Use the following code, 53414646. That's 53414646, menti.com. And here's our question, which should come up on the next slide. How comfortable would you be talking to Ministry of Finance colleagues to make a financial case for economic inclusion programs? Not at all, a little comfortable, or very comfortable. I'm going to let this Mentimeter roll. I know it's a Thursday. For some of us, it does feel like a Friday. But let's see a few more responses that we might get to that question. How comfortable would you be talking to a Ministry of Finance colleague to make a financial case for economic inclusion? Not at all, a little comfortable, and somebody who feels really comfortable. If you're those people who are a little bit comfortable or not at all, we'd love to hear from you in the Q&A box. Put out your questions, put out your hesitations, put out your concerns. And if you're really comfortable, put out some suggestions and observations from your own experience. and we hope to bring those Q&A in. But without further ado, let's move on to our first segment of discussion. We've got 2 or 3 segments of discussion today, and I'd like to really welcome Bessie Msusa, the Chief Economist from Malawi, working within the Ministry of Planning and Economic Development, and Sauda Ahmed, who is the head of the World Bank unit, the Ministry of Finance, also from Ghana. So I'm going to just start off, Sauda and Bessie, just with a general opening question for you both. Tell us the perspective that you bring to this discussion. Introduce us, for those of you who don't know, to the context of Malawi. Let's start off with you, Bessie, first.
Thank you, Colin. I'm Bessie from Ministry of Economic Planning and Development and Public Sector Reforms. So we are the custodians of the social protection policy in Malawi, and we also have a program which is the operationalizing the policy. So the Malawi National Social Support Program too focuses more on building resilience through cash price interventions and also economic inclusion. Thank you.
Thanks, Bessie. Sauda, over to you. Maybe introduce yourself and the context where you sit, and tell us a little bit about Ghana.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I'm Sauda Ahmed, Head of World Bank Unit at the Ministry of Finance. I've been involved in development cooperation practice in the last 18 years, and I've been involved in the design of the World Bank funded social protection programs in Ghana. The poverty reduction in Ghana has often been on the front burner of most governments, and the issue of economic inclusion can't really be contextualized within this within the poverty reduction platform. In fact, Article 36 of the 1992 Constitution enjoins the state to provide adequate means of livelihood and sustainable employment to the needy people. And for that matter, successive governments have often implemented various poverty reduction interventions that led to significant decline in poverty rate from 36% in 1992 to about 8.3 to about 8.4% in 2012. So this should let us know how important poverty reduction is in Ghana. But I want us to note that currently Ghana's population is about 30.4 million, of which 8.2 people percent rather, of which 8.2% are poor, and this converts to about 2.5 people in my mind. And government is currently saying we are leaving no one behind. And if we are leaving no one behind, what are we doing? But if we want to narrow down to the EI context, I would want to say that the current EI context is rooted in the implementation of the Ghana Social Protection Program funded by the bank. It's a popular program that has achieved so much and has set the pace for government to leapfrog to bundle various interventions to alleviate poverty in Ghana. What the program did was it financed the government flagship cash transfer program, which we call the LEAP, and then it's also introduced a labor-intensive public works that was targeted at the rural poor who would usually migrate to the urban areas during agricultural off seasons. But during the implementation, as the discussions were going on as to the exit strategies in these communities, it was realized that there need to be sustainable incomes for these rural people, because some of them that participated in the labor-intensive public works, we recognize that they were quite entrepreneurial and also able to work. So about economic inclusion.
Sorry, Sauda, to cut you off there. I'd like to hear me? I hear you very well. I hear you very well. I wanted to just come in to maybe link some of these questions. I think what's really striking for both of the panelists at the moment in terms of opening up this discussion on sustainability, you have both moved immediately into the policy frameworks, into the policy enabling environments, into the strategic framework around your sector. I find this really interesting. Often amongst social protection practitioners, when we talk to the Ministry of Finance, we immediately think this is all about budget lines and we need to get a budget line moving, and that's the start and the end of the conversation. Well, not the end, but certainly the start. And Bessie and Sauda, this gives me a follow-up question to you both. I'd like you to talk us through, as maybe people who are not working in ministries of finance, what exactly are your priorities? If you could think of 2 or 3 big ticket priorities in terms of understanding a strategy for financing. So what do you say to your partners, to your fellow government officials as they think about building these programs? We've heard about the LEAP, we've heard about the SSLRP a little bit from Bessie, we can hear a little bit more. But when people come to you to talk about financing, to ensuring government commitments, what are those priorities that you're currently looking at? And maybe, Bessie, let me start off with you, and Sauda will come back to you then just in a minute. Over to you, Bessie.
Thank you. So at the moment, as we are operationalizing the Malawi National Social Support Program 2, we have the MASA 4, which was funded by IDA resources. So in that MASA 4, we had a little bit of some resources, about $5 million to implement economic activities under the leadership of COMSIP, Community Savings, and then we moved to social support for resilient livelihood. We have a big chunk in that community of social support for resilient livelihood. That's a successor for MASAF. So we have set aside $20 million to implement economic activities, because we have realized that cash alone cannot take the social cash transfer beneficiaries who are vulnerable, who are poor, into sustainable livelihood. But we also have other donors who are implementing some activities under the graduation concept, which we built under the Malawi National Social Support Program 2. So we have EU. They are supporting some international NGOs, supporting livelihood activities and even graduation programs. We also have the FAMZE program, which is financed by the government of Malawi to the tune of $5,153,000, and the also International Fund for Agriculture, that's IFAD, putting some $15 million for economic inclusion for the social cash transfer beneficiaries. The idea is to give them additional push so that they invest in economic activities, into IG activities, and then they move into sustainable livelihood. If you are talking about sustainability or in terms of financing, we have already seen that government has already put some resources, some $5 million under the FAMZE program. But we are also looking at scaling down the agriculture input subsidy so that we can include economic empowerment into these beneficiaries of social protection programs in Malawi. Under EU, in 2017, EU pumped in some 9 million euros, and in 2019, they pumped in some 4 million euros into the graduation programs. Under SOSURE, Social Support for Resilience, they have also pumped in some 5 million euros into economic activities. So we are looking at having, in the near future, for long term, looking at creating a basket fund mechanism so that all resources from government and the other donors should put those financial resources into one basket so that we distribute them equally, and then we implement these activities for poverty reduction and social protection. Thank you, Colin.
Bessie, you raised a couple of themes here as we think about sustainable financing. You talked a little bit about the resource allocation, the subsidy reform, the possibility of looking at maybe less effective programs towards more effective programs. Bessie, is that an easy issue to unpack at country level? How do you navigate that conversation with different ministries and the politics around the reform of a large-scale subsidy intervention and thinking through financing for something else? And Sauda, I'll come to you just in a moment. But if you could talk to us, Bessie, I think our participants would be curious to hear a little bit more about that question of and the potential of that resource reallocation.
Thank you. In terms of talking to our colleagues in the Ministry of Agriculture and actually the Treasury Department, because we are backed by evidence that economic inclusion is the way to go. Graduation activities is the way to go, because that's the way these people can graduate into sustainable livelihoods. So we are talking with our colleagues in the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Treasury so that we'll see how we can scale down and move towards more economic inclusion activities moving forward in the long term. Thank you.
Thanks, Bessie. And we'll come back to you in a moment just to hear a little bit more about this donor landscape and how you handle and coordinate multiple donor programs and the opportunities and the challenges that you see about that. But first, let's go back to Sauda and let's have that question from the Ghana perspective. What are the top number of priorities from your side in terms of investing in this space within Ghana? I think one of the big themes that come up in this source of conversation is on government commitments. So how do you see this development of a financing strategy? Over to you, Sauda.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I must say that government is committed within the social protection space. For instance, about 70% of the current ongoing cash transfer program is being funded by government. That is the starting point. And as I mentioned earlier in the introduction, our Ghana National Social Protection Strategy envisages the graduation from the LEAP program to hinge on productive inclusion. And as a government, it's really important we recognize that you cannot continue to keep the people down there and keep transferring cash to them when they cannot have sustainable livelihoods. So to that end, I think government has been true, because in our current, the President's coordinated program of economic and social policy, development policies, it is production and financial inclusion policy will be established. Alongside that, what I would have to say is that government has committed part of its IDA funding to social inclusion under the Ghana Productive Safety Net Program. And this is about, I think we committed 6 million, targeting 18,000 persons under the first phase of it. And currently we are processing further $13 million, targeting 35,000 people. So I would say that government is committed, and this legislation is being drafted. That is the bill. The social protection bill is being drafted, and productive inclusion, it's being considered under that legislation. In terms of the budgeting, if I take you back to the fact that the LEAP is already being funded, budget lines can be created within that social protection portfolio to be able to take up the EI. Please, I cannot hear.
We can hear you, Sauda. I think you just had a brief interruption. You were saying that challenge with the budget lines and the duplication of budget lines, I think, in the social protection sector. I'm going to move over to Bessie, just while we try to get Sauda on and Sauda reconnected. Bessie, you work in an environment where you are the person.
I can hear you. I can hear you now. Can I continue?
Yeah, let's over to you, and then I'll come in very quickly with a round of questions. One final quick question, because I want to move off this segment. Back over to you, Sauda.
Thank you very much. So the creation of budget lines for EI is something that is feasible and would be considered by the ministry within the short term, because we need to graduate the people from LEAP and to give them sustainable livelihoods. However, I think when it comes to prioritizing as to whether we do EI or other government funded program, we would encourage the practitioners to try to make case for this thing by providing evidence, because currently I think that the thinking, I always say that it's a thinking that EIs are expensive, especially when you have to target the poor. But the truth is that once you go down and look at the long-term impact of EIs, for instance, once we get into EIs and formalize the businesses that we will be creating, these businesses will end up paying taxes. The people will pay taxes, or even will get consumption, since their incomes will increase, will end up getting consumption taxes from these people. This is not to say that we are elevating people from poverty just to tax them, but to say that there is a case for us to make, to be thinking of how we mainstream EI so that we bring everybody on board. Thank you.
Thanks, Sauda. I need to, before just moving on to Greg and to Sarah, Bessie, let's conclude with you. Maybe if I could put you on the spot just for 1 minute. What's the single biggest challenge that you have in terms of domestic resource mobilization? Obviously, the fiscal envelope is very, very tight, but when it comes to thinking about allocating national resources and convincing your minister and your Ministry of Finance to make these fiscal investments, what's the single biggest challenge that you face in this regard?
I think the biggest challenge we face in this regard, I think it's because we don't have a big fiscal space to look at the issue of social protection, but maybe because I think we don't even have a legal framework to back us up in terms of putting resources, committed resources into social protection. But as the Minister of Economic Planning under the Poverty Reduction and Social Protection, we want to look into that one as we are reviewing the National Social Support Policy, which is underway. We want to put that agenda on top of us, have a legal framework so that government is committed to put more resources into social protection. Over.
Thanks so much. Sauda and Bessie, will come back to you in a few minutes, but let me bring on both Greg and Sarah. But before moving to Greg and Sarah, just a couple of takeouts that are coming across in this conversation. So with Bessie and Sauda, we went through some discussions around the enabling environments, the policy, the strategy, the linkages to those broader sector discussions, and the role of evidence. But we also discussed some of the more important innovations within the sector in terms of the legal frameworks, the budget mechanisms, and then some innovations around which countries are thinking about to put some domestic resource mobilization on the table, whether that was through resource reallocation from efficient to less efficient programs, or whether that was to trying to look towards specific funds and pooled funding mechanisms to move this agenda ahead. I'd like to introduce both Sarah. Sarah is a senior social protection economist at the World Bank. Greg is the Deputy Assistant Administrator at USAID for the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. Sarah, let me bring you first in on this question. Sarah, we have worked together, full disclosure, for many years, really working through some of these discussions at country level. Maybe, Sarah, could you talk us through the perspective that you bring to this, some of the lessons that you have seen in your operational engagements, and some reactions that you've heard from Bessie and Sauda. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. And it's a real pleasure to be here today to share some experience. And I should qualify this by saying the lessons and experience I'm drawing upon are very much from low income and middle income countries, largely in Africa. So I just want to, again, frame that in terms of explaining some of why I'm saying some of what I am saying. And I think I was trying to think about what some of the key lessons might be, and I think they echo very much what Bessie and Sauda were saying. And so first, I think for me, an overall lesson I've learned is that it takes time. This is not something that's going to happen overnight. Ministries of Finance budget on a particular cycle. It tends to take over a year to get something into a budget. There are particular points in the calendar year that you need to be cognizant of. You need to understand what evidence needs to be tabled when. But more importantly, governments plan at a minimum 3 years out. There's often a medium-term financing framework that has firm or indicative commitments. And in some countries, it's critical to get your budgets in those medium-term financing frameworks. And so this is not an exercise of going to a Ministry of Finance once, having a meeting and having an outcome. This is about sustained engagement over multiple years and really understanding the budget and the financing cycle of the country with which you are working. And just a small caveat on that, and I think the discussion today is really framed around central government funding and Ministry of Finance funding, but in some countries there's devolved funding managed by municipalities. So it's partly not only knowing the budget cycle and the financing framework, but also where is the money sitting and who has discretionary authority over that funding. So just a comment on that. That's something I've also learned over time. Secondly, you need allies. You need allies both in terms of counterparts in the ministry and the ministries of finance. And ministries of finance are not homogeneous institutions. There's your head of treasury, there's your head of budgeting, there's accounting. You need to speak to those people, understand their concerns, understand how they make decisions, on what basis and when. I've also learned it's really important to have allies within our institutions. I have colleagues who speak much more regularly than myself with ministries of finance. They have a common language. It's good for me to have a common understanding and an allegiance with them so that we can be advocating in a similar way. And similarly, and I'm so happy Greg is here, those allies across donor partners are really important. We tend to have different strengths, different ways of presenting issues, and it's that synergy, I think, that really can create a strong advocacy to a Ministry of Finance. And that comes to some of the issues that Bessie and Sauda mentioned around pooled funding, basket approach to financing, because not only is that partnership important in terms of advocacy and messaging, but also making visible the total amount of existing financing that is going to these programs. It's not a question of government funding or not government funding. It's about all of the funding that's coming into a country, ensuring that to the extent possible, it's reflected in budgets. There is accountability and reporting about that to Parliament so parliamentarians can see it and they understand the impacts. I have 2 more points, but shall I continue, Colin?
Continue, and then we'll move over to Greg. Thanks,
okay, just in terms of time. So my third point is really something that we heard Bessie and Sauda say, which is numbers help. And I think there is a strong understanding and appreciation of the evidence of impacts of productive inclusion programs, economic inclusion programs. But in addition to that, so tabling that evidence is important, and demonstrating the impact and the value of money as compared to other interventions is important. But also simulating and estimating forward-looking costings in terms of what are budgetary requirements, not in 1 year, but in 5, 10, 15 years, against different scenarios in terms of people to be met or poverty impacts that could be achieved, but also sitting that alongside other allocations to other programs, but also anticipated growth in government revenue, the growing of the fiscal space that Bessie mentioned. So it's trying to set out in numbers, how will revenues increase? Because how can the pie grow? And of that pie, what proportion could be allocated to these programs? And then looking at within existing program allocations, where could efficiencies be gained? And then very briefly, the final point is, I think as you said in your introduction, ultimately, we're talking about financing, but ultimately financing is a political choice. Governments have money. They choose how to use it. So we come back to this question of how to make those arguments in a way that is palpable both to our Ministry of Finance colleagues, who tend to be very high qualified technicians, and their political masters, if I can use that term. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Sarah. I think lots of useful information, and I think I'd like to come back to you and possibly Greg later on in the call to think through this question around, as donors, are we doing our best to make this simple for our counterparts in the Ministry of Finance? And also how we actually bring that evidence base on financing, because from my perspective, it seems some of the quality of that financial analysis, costing analysis could actually be better to see that whole totality of investment. So Sarah, maybe you can think about that and we'll come back to it. But Greg, you also bring a complementary and a distinct perspective from USAID. So it would be great if you could just hop in and share your lessons as well.
Sure, and a great discussion so far, and thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to join this great panel. I really enjoyed that first session, hearing from the countries themselves. And I think I really appreciate Bessie raising this issue around how this isn't a handout. This is key to a bottom-up approach to economic growth. But I actually come at this at a slightly different perspective. In addition to being the Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security, I'm the agency's resilience coordinator. And I've been making the case over the last decade about the cost of inaction, the need to invest now to avert backsliding, not only into poverty and hunger, but into crisis levels of hunger, and even crisis levels of hunger that necessitate humanitarian assistance. So we can get into that a little bit later around the evidence. But I do think there's an untold story in terms of impact, in terms of what you're averting by making these investments. And I believe that long before COVID-19, but in the wake of COVID-19 and 120 million, even more projecting into this year, backsliding into poverty and hunger, we've essentially got the global use case made for building resilience. And I believe economic inclusion is the linchpin in resilience programming and building out a resilience portfolio that includes shock responsive social protection, market systems interventions on this end, and economic inclusion is the bridge that ties them together. And so I do think there's an impressive amount of evidence to date, but I don't think it's thought expansively about the return on investment. And I often, when faced with challenges to my pushing on, we need to be working in areas of recurrent crisis, people say the return on investment's not there. And I would say, actually, you're not including that equation, the cost of inaction, which in a place like Ethiopia for the US government alone over 15 years is over $5 billion in humanitarian assistance. So I really think we need to be thinking about it in that way. And I really also appreciate the highlighting of the financing work the government themselves are doing, because I think there's a perception that somehow bilateral donors are going to come in and finance and scale these massive social protection and economic inclusion programs. And I don't think that's our role at all. I don't view us as the scale agent. We can exactly help our partners deliver on testing new models. We have the ability to test and fail in ways maybe they don't. We have the ability to invest in the evidence that we've already heard on this call they're asking for, the evidence that makes a compelling economic argument on the return on investment on these types of investments. So I think that's our role. And I think we really need to, we often fund international local partners. And even if that's outside government funding streams, we've absolutely got to ensure that whatever we're funding in this line is integrated within a broader government-led effort and is layered upon government safety net systems. And we've got to get away. And I think we could all as donors have a little bit of a mea culpa here. This projectized view of the world, that somehow our project reaching these villages reaches 33,000 households and improves their incomes and allows them to sustainably graduate from a safety net program. It's not about those 33,000 households. That's great. But the measure of success of those types of investments is how we've influenced and helped support a government to scale the effort and to reach the magnitude that has the impact that we need to see. And I think you maybe sense an urgency in my voice, because there is an urgency here, not only in the wake of COVID-19, but in the face of accelerating climate impacts and the impacts that's having on households and livelihoods. So let me leave it there, but I'd love to come back later in the discussion to that cost of inaction, because I think that's really central to the equation.
I'm going to pick you up on that question of cost of inaction. I see somebody picking up on it also in the chat box. For those of you in the chat box, this is a great moment to ask questions. I think at the top of the discussion, we said this was a tricky session to organize because it's an imperfect science and there are a lot of political winds in the background. I'd like to bring all the panelists back together just in a moment. But before doing so, Greg and Sarah, let me put you on the spot just for 1 minute each. Greg, you talked about the mea culpa of donors. Sometimes you work in many from a personal perspective, I've worked in many low-income contexts, working with ministries of finance. And it's fair to say that many of our officials are just kind of pulled like ragdolls by different development partners with their own interventions, with their own priorities, week after week, with missions, with audits, people working on systems, people working outside of the systems. Now that's the reality, which is not going to change very quickly. But what are some of the best practices that we can make as funding partners to simplify the life of our counterparts in the Ministry of Finance? Or is this kind of just a distorted reality from my side? Sarah, I'm going to go over to you first.
Oh, I thought that was going to Greg. No, great question, Colin. I think that's really, as you said, both a reality, but also something we should not lose sight of. And I think those of us who've been working in this field for some time can see the winds shifting in terms of appetite within donor agencies for collaboration, for coordination. I mean, I think referencing the Paris Agreement all those years ago, I feel old saying that, as compared to this push now for attribution and accountability. I think there are best practices. I think this is really an exercise of us collectively taking a deep breath and recognizing that what we're trying to do is both reach those 33,000 people, if that was the number, Greg, you used in the village, but also strengthen those government systems so that they can ultimately be accountable and transparent and deliver for their citizens. And I think where you and I work together in Ethiopia is a best case, where you had at one point up to, I think it was 11 or 12 donors pooling funding into one pot. It wasn't all going through the Ministry of Finance system. Where it could, it was, but I think where it couldn't, and I look to my colleague from USAID, there was a real willingness to have comparable reporting systems, one set of reports, one set of financial audits, a harmonized mission schedule, but most importantly, agreeing with the government a common set of objectives and targets, and collectively moving towards those. So rather than the pull in different directions, it was almost like a wave moving forward together. And there you really have this synergistic effect of energy and attention and concern all moving together. So I hope that begins to answer your question, but I'm very happy to elaborate on that some more.
Well, let's see, we'll take in Sauda and Bessie, and I'd like some reactions from Sauda and Bessie on this segment and kind of some takeouts that you have both been having as you're listening to both the counterparts from USAID and the World Bank. Greg, over to you.
Yeah, I thought that was coming to me first too, Sarah. Yeah, I think Sarah makes an excellent point. So first of all, I don't think that's a distorted view of reality, but I think the sands are shifting. And I think there's an appetite for change. And I think we do have, I've found really in driving the agency's work on resilience forward over the last decade, what you need is good models, good country-led models that you can point to and work with other governments and, in my case, USAID missions to understand what it looks like to align behind a country-led effort. And Ethiopia is a good example. Kenya, ending drought emergencies effort is another good example, where you sort of leave a little bit of autonomy and ego at the door and really embrace a partnership with countries who are leading. And I think the fact that we're hearing about countries financing these things sort of is consistent with that shift in how we think about partnering. And so the reason I use that example of 33,000 households, because at the time, everybody celebrated the 33,000 households, and that's great for 33,000 households. But that was in the context of Ethiopia, where 33,000 households, it's a drop in a bucket. And so what's much more important, if we're talking about transformation, is how we're partnering with government. We can, like I said, we can test, we can fail, we can build an evidence base, we can support, but we're not going to be the scale agents. Let's recognize who the scale agents are. Let's support them to do their jobs. Let's not think about our projects as ends in themselves. Let's think about them as policy and influence tools. And I do think there's been a mentality shift, even in my 10 years at USAID. It's gone under different names, but the sense that we measure success not merely by the development outcomes amongst the limited set of households or villages or communities we're working with, but we measure success by moving the needle on helping build the capacity of countries to tackle their own development challenges, this one being a central one, of course.
So we've heard a lot. There's a lot of note taking going on. I see Bessie, I see Sauda scribbling a few things. Bessie and Sauda, let me just bring you in on this point. Let's turn this into a little bit of a conversation. What's on your mind as you're hearing Sarah and Greg speak? What resonates? What needs to be clarified? We have a few, I'd like to move to a few thorny issues before the end of the phone call. But let me go to Sauda first, as you've been listening in this conversation just for a couple of minutes. We're running tight on time. Sauda, what are your reflections as you hear this conversation?
Thank you very much, Colin. It was really interesting listening to our colleagues on the other side, because everything that I heard was what it is being summarized. But my kind of something that I want to re-echo is what Sarah is saying, advocacy. For instance, if we have produced our evidence, who knows about the evidence? One, also, we need to find allies. These are reasons that we cannot run away from. That if you sit in the sector ministries and all that, and you don't have people at where resources are allocated, understanding the needs, understanding what is it in it for the country to invest in a specific program, I'm afraid we'll do all the good job, but we won't have people here. So having champions, advocating, having champions after we have found the evidence is very important. In the interest of time, I think I'll stop it with just these two observations.
Thanks. And that was a theme that we really picked up on in the opening session as well, and the role of political acceptability and what this means also for parliamentarians beyond just the officials within the Ministry of Finance. Bessie, let's bring you in here. This is your opportunity to clarify and correct or complement anything you might have heard from Sarah and Greg.
Yeah, I think we well summarized. I think Sarah has already said that I think government can finance social protection. It's just the political will. There is fiscal space. You cannot say that there is no fiscal space. There is fiscal space as long as there is political will. And also there is an appetite to change from giving cash alone to cash plus interventions so that we build resilience. In the end, I think we should reduce the caseload for humanitarian interventions in the long run. If we build resilience, economic inclusion to our beneficiaries, eventually they will get into sustainable livelihood and reduce the caseload for humanitarian. So that's what I can say. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Well, let me kind of turn the screws and put our panelists a little bit more on the spot. Sarah, I'm going to walk through a few, what I think are thorny issues in this sector. So let me probe the first one with you. I want to build on what Bessie said. So Bessie actually talks about this question of building on social protection investments, building on those cash transfer investments, but also this trade-off and discussion around the humanitarian sector as well, and understanding those issues too. It strikes me that in principle, all of this makes sense, but in practice, there are minefields along the way, both on the humanitarian financing, but possibly even within the social protection financing, where sometimes people see economic inclusion as an either or, it's a replacement to social protection. So the short question to you, Sarah, is what is the potential to piggyback on this social protection reform, on these social protection investments in this particular space? Over to you.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really excellent question, Colin. So I think my first response, my first reflection is that in almost every case I've drawn upon in the discussion so far, I've not named them, but there are many, they're almost all this intersection of safety nets and productive inclusion. So I think at least in the case of Africa, there is this natural bringing together of these discussions. And if anything, the productive inclusion, I think, is born out of the concerns that Bessie and Sauda mentioned around graduation and the sustained need to provide cash transfer support to the poor, and the recognition that these people can do more, provided they're given additional investments, because the cash transfer alone will not move them out of poverty in any sustainable manner. So I think there's very much potential. If anything, the sticking point is what you said, is how to frame this as not an either or. Because often politicians and ministries of finance see this as a strategy to scale down safety net support. And so I think in that discussion, it's trying to be very clear about the complementary nature of the interventions, and B, putting forward the evidence on the differential impacts of the two programs. They are not the same. They really are needed often actually in parallel, and removing the safety net from the productive inclusion doesn't always, would leave us potentially some households in a situation where they can't take full advantage of those investments. And thirdly, trying to be really clear about the fact that these are not the same households. This is a really funny point to make. It's so minor. And yet in those discussions with ministries of finance, often there's this idea that it's a stagnant group of people, but actually those numbers are always different people. They're churning. Poverty is dynamic. And somehow making that really clear to our colleagues. So this is a productive, it's not an either or, and really to being able to stress that and bring the evidence to bear on that. And I just want to make, if I may, make a very brief comment on the cost of inaction, or shall I wait?
Let me pop over to Greg, and I'll bring you in at the end, Sarah, if you don't mind. But Greg, I think one of the most compelling points that I've heard you make in the past has been this question on the cost of inaction. It's something that came up in the chat box, and it's really a very inspiring point to make. And I remember being in a meeting with you and you raised this point, and then I kind of logged off after the meeting and I said to myself, okay, how do I do that now? So what do I do? And I drew blanks, because I have some of my evidence evaluations, I have some of my qualitative evaluations, but I'm not so sure I can cost all of that. And I know from the work that I've done with my country partners that our work on costing and our work on public expenditure reviews, certainly in the social protection sector, could be better. It could be stronger. So what tips would you give to people to really deliver on this question of costs of inaction? How do we get there? Over to you, Greg.
Yeah, I think first of all, we got to think about costs broadly. So I often frame it as costs expressed in terms of lost lives, livelihoods, and aspirations, losses to national and regional economies, and the unsustainable cost of going back to the same people in same places every few years with recurrent humanitarian spending, and then attempting to quantify that, right? And I remember we, as USAID, we fund an early warning system called FuseNet, the Famine Early Warning System. And early days in this work, I said, could you please rack up for me how much humanitarian spending the US government has put into this country, that country, and this country? And they said, well, it's going to take a minute because nobody's ever asked that question. And I was kind of blown away, really? Nobody's asked that question? So I think we got to get creative. One other area of work that is very nascent, but we are making progress, is actually trying to measure averted humanitarian need by looking at sort of food security and economic threshold equivalents. And it's still early days on that. And I do think we need more analytic work on that, because even some of the World Bank data, the panel data that we're getting in the wake of COVID-19 is showing differential outcomes. Many people are backsliding, but some are backsliding more than others. And what is that? What is the sources of resilience that explain that? And so really thinking of using panel data, recurrent shock-triggered monitoring systems to really capture what happens to households, not only in the moment of a shock, but how hard a hit they take and how quickly they recover. That's the sort of resilience approach to measurement. And I think it's really germane here, because there is the question of how do these investments help build people's capacity to take advantage of opportunities in the economy, both formal and informal, and move them out of poverty and off of social assistance. And what's the cost savings of that? but there's also the projected cost savings of not having people backslide in droves in the face of shock events. And COVID-19 makes the case, like I said earlier, but as we're looking beyond COVID-19 at conflict, accelerating climate impacts, we really need to be thinking about how we make the case now for investing in these types of things like economic inclusion to avert backsliding into poverty, hunger, and in the extreme crisis level of hunger. So it's an area of work I think we can collaborate as donors. I think it's a service we can provide to our partner country governments who are trying to make the case in their own countries to really think expansively about the costs of inaction. And I think it's a great sort of rallying call out of this session for us to come together and drive that work forward. And happy to share the nascent work we have been doing on this after the call.
Thanks, Greg. Just want to underscore the question. I mean, you highlight these big, broad themes, but just to underscore this question of sometimes even answering the most basic of questions: how much are we spending? How many beneficiaries do we have? It can be quite striking how far the answer is from your fingertips sometimes when you are in these discussions. I'd like to move to a final round. Sarah, I'm just going to give you 30 seconds or so just to come in on the costs of inaction, because I would like to come back to Sauda and Bessie to help us wrap up a little bit. We have 5 minutes left for this discussion. Over to you, Sarah.
So just briefly, I agree with everything Greg just said. It was only to make the point that, so similarly, in my experience, ministries of finance tend not to have any oversight or really knowledge of the humanitarian response, the volumes, the amounts, the economic costs or financial equivalent of food aid, for example. So just bringing us back to this discussion about ministries of finance, it's somehow to make that visible to them, either by at least informing them or ensuring that they're coordinating with the responsible parts of the government on that humanitarian financing, which is almost universally off budget. Or even in a more extreme case, to use that word, as to how to bring that on budget so that those costs, this is not the full extent of cost of inaction, I completely agree, Greg, but at the very least, so the ministries of finance understand what we're talking about.
Okay, so we have 3 minutes left, and I want to give the final words both to Sauda and to Bessie, and I'd like to put you in the spot just for a minute each. If you had to give one piece of advice to the participants in the audience who are logged in and who are going to be listening to this call, and who might be working in a context where resources are constrained, where poverty is high, and they want to influence the Ministry of Treasury, the Ministry of Finance on scaling up economic inclusion, what would be your single piece of advice in terms of where some of these peers working should start? Sauda, over to you.
Thank you very much. The one piece of advice that I'll give to practitioners, it's for them to generate the evidence. And in the case of Ghana, government will want to see the impacts on jobs creation and sustainable incomes and the cost effectiveness. So I stress once again that the evidence is very important. And when we have generated the evidence, as I said, let everyone know about it. Let everybody hear about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sauda, and over to you, Bessie.
I would agree with Sarah. I think let's generate evidence. In some cases, the evidence is already there, but let's just bring it on board to our colleagues in Treasury so that they should see they should look at economic inclusion as part of development, not as part of wasting resources. So another advice is just let's coordinate government and our counterparts, development partners. Let's coordinate, put resources together, and then help these poor and vulnerable households move into sustainable livelihoods by implementing these economic activities in a coordinated and harmonized manner. Thank you.
Greg and Sarah, I'll give you 30 seconds, but we do need to close the session. I saw Greg, you were coming in on the chat box if there's anything final you want to add.
Yeah, I think we're guilty as development practitioners of a big fail in terms of translating this evidence into meaningful terms that move different audiences. And that's why I talk very differently when I'm up on my own Capitol Hill talking to my Congress about this. I'm talking about averting the humanitarian spending of the US government. So knowing your audience, translating evidence into terms that actually speak to them is going to be critical. And I really do think this is something this group could rally about. I'm excited about it. And I think bringing the evidence together and translating it and working with partners in Ghana, Malawi, and elsewhere to help them do what clearly they're already leading on is really, really, really key to moving this agenda forward.
Sarah, the final word goes over to you.
I mean, there's so much wisdom. I'm not really sure what to add. Maybe indeed use that evidence, translate it in the way that Greg is saying, but talk to Ministry of Finance, sit down and talk to them and put that evidence on the table and see what their reaction is. Maybe it's not being framed in the way that they digest. Maybe you're just using the wrong words. It's half the time it's language or spin. Speak to parliamentarians, speak to members of the opposition if that is acceptable. Build those coalitions and really invest in the time and effort. I mean, so much of this is just about talking to people and understanding where they're coming from and what those push points could be. Understand the system and then don't give up.
Thank you very much. It's been a rapid tour de force. I genuinely want to thank our participants. Can we take the evaluation down just for 1 minute, just so I can see everybody, if that's okay? I really want to thank our participants just for putting a huge amount of effort into preparing for this session today. I'm not going to summarize anything, but what I scribbled on my paper was time frame, a long-term agenda. I scribbled on my paper shifting sands. So this question that this is an effort of looking at that the winds are changing, sands and winds are both changing. But the final point, focusing on a call to action, both evidence as well as communication, and how well we are doing to actually communicate in this space. We do have an evaluation coming up, and please let me thank all of our panelists today. We do have a closing session coming up in the next few minutes. There's a 3 or 4 minute health break. Information about this closing session will come up in your chat box, so please follow the link that's there. And please rate this session. Did you like it or loathe it? It's perfectly fine. It helps us to make these sessions better in the future. All of these sessions will have been recorded. They will be kind of available on request for you to access. Thank you very much for joining us today.